for English. Okay, so tonight we're going to give a brief overview of some of the things that we're seeing at the border right now. We're going to talk about a request for assistance that we received from our partners from another NGO in El Paso. We're going to discuss our government's policies towards people at the border right now, especially with regards to asylum seekers and people from countries we don't have diplomatic relationships with. And then we're going to talk about some options for different folks in community or organizations or faith communities, how people can get involved in supporting folks who are already coming to Denver and who may be coming to Denver in greater numbers. So it's not, I am not the penultimate expert on the policies in Venezuela. I'm not a big expert on all of the driving factors, but I'll cover a few of them. And then I've compiled a reading list from people who know a lot more than I do about some of the root causes that are driving this right now. And then I think we'd like to host a spotlight on in December or January that goes into more depth, and or invite you to some of the things that Denver Justice and Peace is planning in the coming months that also go into more depth on those root and driving causes of migration. I know that we have folks who have a fair amount of expertise in the room, virtual or in person, already. So maybe we could have people raise your actual hand or your virtual hand if you volunteered at the border or traveled extensively in Central or South America, just to sort of show who in the room feels like you know something about this already. Okay, cool. I also know that we have some of our Not One More members here who personally, who come from countries of origin in the area and who've also crossed themselves the border, or are working with people who've recently crossed the border. So I would count you all as experts as well. And towards the end, I think we can do some question and answer around some of that if we have time. Does that sound like what you all signed up for tonight? Okay. So the policies of trying to deter asylum seekers from entering the United States by using detention and expulsion and deportation started under Obama. Secretary Clinton responded to some pretty large outmigrations from Central America to the US by detaining families in family detention centers. So our jails, they were not, sort of community centers or hotels. And the point of that policy was actually to try and deter more people from coming. The theory of the government is if we make it really hard, word will spread and people will no longer come. Those policies were made even more strict under President Trump. And one of the policies that they had on their list of priorities when Trump took office was to try and restrict the right to asylum. And the pandemic provided the perfect opportunity for the administration to do that by enacting a public health policy called Title 42. Title 42 allows the president to close our borders if there's a public health emergency. Hola, Erika. gracias por venir. Hay interpretación, si gusta. So President Trump enacts Title 42 pretty immediately when the pandemic began. It was on the list of presidential powers he could use to limit migration to the U.S. And what that meant is that no one could come in initially, and then they rolled it back so that anyone with a visa, which basically means anyone who has status or money, could come in and out of the U.S. But people who were approaching our border for asylum could not do that anymore at a port of entry. They couldn't go to our door and knock it and say, I'm afraid for my life. They would just be turned away. So the only way for people to access asylum is to cross the border without inspection, meaning between official ports, and find a border patrol agent and say, I'm afraid for my life. This was compounded by another program called the Migrant Protection Protocol. It's not really protecting migrants, it's trying to keep them out. And that policy is winding down now, but what it did was make people take a number and wait in Mexico for their court hearing, no matter where they were from. So you might also have heard it called the Remain in Mexico policy. And that created camps of people at big cities like Tijuana and El Paso, across from San Diego and El Paso, Juarez, on the Mexico side. And those camps were not refugee camps. They didn't receive assistance from the United Nations. Those were camps that people self-organized to wait for their number to be called. And once their number was called, they went into court virtually at the border in a tent city with no legal representation or access to lawyers in the U.S. So a very small number of people who had those court hearings, like less than 5%, had their asylum approved because the judge is on a video camera thousands of miles away, and they had no legal representation. So that policy is winding down, but it's not clear how people who are still waiting in that take a number line will get court eventually. And a lot of the folks who've been waiting in line for months have also been targets of violence and exploitation in Mexico. And so many of them have also decided to cross the border without inspection with their families to try and be safer. Because those camps have refugee camps, even when organized by the UN, are notorious for security issues. And then you add the fact that there's no authority who's organizing the camps, and you can understand why they're pretty unsafe. So then, the other policy that has been happening over the last decade or so is the U.S. has been really opposed to the government in Venezuela and has imposed a lot of sanctions, dozens and dozens of sanctions on Venezuela since 2015. The U.S. foreign policy goal is to force Maduro, who's the president, out. And right now, the U.S. actually doesn't recognize Maduro as the president of Venezuela. They recognize a guy who hasn't lived in Venezuela in decades, but who is from there, as the president of Venezuela. And in the last 3 years, what it's meant is we don't have diplomatic relationships anymore with Venezuela. We also don't have official diplomatic relationship with Cuba or Nicaragua. And you'll find out more why this is important in a second. So the number of people who've been coming to the U.S. seeking asylum from across the world has been on the rise the last 3 to 4 years. It kind of ebbs and flows, but it's all the reasons that we usually talk about. There's conflict in people's countries of origin. There's U.S. imperialism that makes their economies, contributes to their economies not being sustainable, and then their own government's management of their economy. And then climate change is a bigger driving factor each year. And so over the decades, there have been nonprofit organizations and faith-based organizations all along the border who have set up, dating back to the 70s, who set up shelters to receive people who've crossed into the U.S., who oftentimes need a space to rest and to rehydrate and to get healthier before they move on. And those shelter networks have grown with this demand from people seeking safety and refuge in the U.S. And over the last few years, those networks even extend up into northern New Mexico and northern Arizona and northern Texas. The folks along the border have been very resourceful in kind of self-organizing space for people when Border Patrol releases more folks, or more folks are successful in entering without inspection by Border Patrol. And what's been happening since January is, as some of these policies are easing at the border, we're seeing more folks being released by Border Patrol into the U.S. And when Border Patrol apprehends, like, say, 10 or 15,000 people along the border in a day, they usually immediately expel about 65% of those people. So it's not a deportation. They just say, you don't qualify, you shouldn't be here, here's the door. The other 35% of people they've been letting in are mostly family, people with children, with minors. And then those folks are placed into humanitarian parole, which just allows you to be here, but doesn't give you a work permit, or into asylum proceedings, which allows you to eventually get to a court hearing with a judge to determine whether your case meets the requirements. What's shifted since January, February is more people coming from countries that we don't have diplomatic relationships with, who can't be expelled under international law. And so the Border Patrol has to release, for example, Venezuelans or Cubans into the U.S. on top of the 35% of people they were already releasing into the U.S. You can see how this has created a bigger demand on that shelter network at the border. And then the next wrinkle in that is that most of the countries we don't have diplomatic relationships with are what we call first-generation immigrants, where they don't have a loved one or a friend or a family member in the U.S. They're the first people to be coming to the U.S., or they're the first people to be coming in a very long time. There is a Venezuelan community in Colorado, but most of them came in the 70s under a different set of foreign policy stuff that I'll give you a reading list on. But they don't have, those folks don't have strong relationships in Venezuela anymore. So they're not family or friends of the people who are now coming to the U.S. And the same is true for Cubans who are coming now and Nicaraguans who are coming now. They're from communities that haven't sent large numbers of people to the U.S. before. So when those folks get to, and we also see that somewhat with Cameroon, depending on what our country's current policies are, and a few other majority Black countries in Africa, and then also a couple countries in Southeast Asia. So it's not only Latinos, but I'm focusing on Venezuelans because that's who we're mostly seeing in Colorado right now. So then what happens is the Border Patrol has to release them. The shelters want to accommodate them, but the folks that are coming don't have anyone who can who can help them orient to the U.S. and find a place to live. So at first, I think the shelters were trying to let them stay for a longer period of time, but what that meant is then they couldn't give beds to a family that's another family that's being held in Border Patrol custody, right? And so they've been trying to move folks out of the border region where there are a fair amount of Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, and Cubans, Cameroonians, other folks trying to find a way to establish themselves in the U.S. already and help them connect with networks of support in the interior. And when we spoke with some of the shelter directors from the border region, they called us because we did this in 2019, when President Trump pulled a similar kind of stunt to what Governors Abbott and DeSantis are doing now in terms of sending buses and kind of overwhelming the shelter system at the border. We did accept a series of buses, and then the administration decided it wasn't causing the chaos they wanted, and so they shut the border down, which was unfortunate because we were happy to welcome folks. So those shelter directors reached out to us, and you know, their charge to us is to pick up our part of the puzzle of welcoming people to the U.S. That this is something that they've been doing for sort of the whole United States in the name of all of us for decades, and now is the moment where they need help from us to make that welcome real somewhere other than just border states. So that happened Labor Day weekend, and a few of us from the Colorado Hosting Asylum Network, Casa de Paz, and a local faith community each of us received a call from the shelter directors, so we jumped on a call. And we've been trying to suss out a welcoming strategy that could be both for people who are arriving on their own right now and don't have support, and for if we say yes to a bus from our nonprofit partners, and for if one of our friendly governors from Texas or Florida decides to fly us people or send us a bus without telling us. So the last piece I'll say about that, and then I want to pause for questions, is these two governors have been busing or flying people to various cities around the country: Washington, D.C., New York, Florida, now Chicago. Kind of slowly moving west, the places that they're sending folks. And Denver was one of those cities on the list of cities that these governors released a couple months ago. So that's the other reason we're preparing for that. When they do that, they don't tell the governor of the state or anyone in the city that they're sending a plane or a bus. They just do it. So that's the need to be sort of rapid response prepared for a larger amount of people. So that's the background up to this point that's sort of very big picture, I want to say a little bit about the outreach that ICE and FEMA have done and some of our conversations with the city and the state. But I want to stop there and see if there's any questions about what I've shared so far, because that was a lot of talking. Okay. So then the second piece I'll say is when the Biden administration decided to try and end Title 42, they freed up some money inside the Federal Emergency Management Administration, known as FEMA, by the acronym. And that money is for cities or big nonprofits to address some of the shelter and other needs of folks who are being released into the interior. It's a little bit complex how to access that money because it's federal money and it comes with a bunch of requirements, and so you need a larger nonprofit that has experience with that to draw that money down, or a city or a state government. And you probably, we feel that you also need a nonprofit or a city or a state that's familiar with running sort of a midterm shelter, like a 1 month to 3 month shelter, because that's not AFSC's expertise. It's not the Colorado Hosting Asylum Network's expertise, right? And we don't want to do it poorly, but all of us could support with volunteers and orientation, know your rights, those types of things. And that's the gap that we've identified. So we have a faith community who has space and who's able to act as that initial 72-hour short-term shelter. And then we have Colorado Hosting Asylum Network that that is awesome and is able to train up people who want to do longer-term accompaniment of families or individuals who come through and who don't know people. And the way that that model works is to have a group of folks who are supporting the person who's hosting those individuals. But what we don't have is somewhere for folks to go after 72 hours if they don't know anyone in the U.S. And while they're sort of waiting for either to find work and become sufficient themselves, or to be able to hook up with a person or a community who will accompany them. So the ICE and FEMA reached out to AFSC and a bunch of national organizations back in May to say that they would also like to work with us to send us, in a coordinated way, a bus or a plane of people who are released. But they really didn't have any resources to offer us, other than they wouldn't send us too many buses, like we could just determine when, and that they could maybe tell us who's on the bus. And then they referenced these FEMA dollars. So since Labor Day, we've met with the city of Denver, and we've met with the state of Colorado and the city of Aurora to talk about this midterm shelter gap that we have. And we're in the process of trying to figure out how to talk with the state government about freeing up midterm shelter spaces outside the metro area, where people might have a chance of finding work and affording a place to live. But so far, we don't have any commitment. The city of Denver is supporting us on the short-term shelter space, and they're also trying to talk with some of the larger nonprofits like the United Ways and the American Red Crosses about whether they would be willing to be a fiscal sponsor for those FEMA dollars. But we don't have any commitments there yet either. So what that means is we're trying to ready our partners who are already supporting houseless folks to be able to identify people who are potentially asylum seekers. We're trying to find other ways to bring community around folks. But we've already seen between Colorado Hosting Asylum Network, AFSC Colorado, and Casa de Paz, you know, like dozens of Venezuelans in the last couple of months who have come to Denver for whatever reason, or Longmont, or Summit County, and who don't have that support. So we've been trying to connect with them and start to offer some of those supports. One of the reasons we do know that people come is that Border Patrol lists Denver as an address on their form and tells them that if they can make it here to that address, they'll receive support. So we saw that just last week with some folks who showed up at the American Red Cross thinking they had hit the final mile of their journey to the United States, and the American Red Cross was like, we have no idea what you're talking about, we don't know what to do, and was able to get connected with Chan and Casa de Paz and AFSC. So this effort is pretty horizontal, meaning like there's not any one nonprofit that's in charge of making sure that all of the things happen, or that there's a connection between each of the things we can offer for the people who are coming. That's one of the things we hope we can get funding for, is someone who can coordinate those transitions between the short term, the midterm, and Chan, the network that Chan will, not the network, but the people that Chan will train up. So our ask in all of this, there's a few options. One option is to talk with your community, whether it's the faith community or another kind of organization or group you participate in, about these options. We're really going to need a collective effort to help people make this transition and resettle in Colorado well. The second pieces are either supporting the faith community that's running the short-term shelter by supporting with those volunteer needs. There'll be transportation needs, meals, and intake, and overnight, people who can stay overnight with folks in that short-term shelter. So that's one option. Considering having your faith community be the short-term shelter starting in January. So the faith community who stepped up can only do it through January. They can do October, November, January, December, and then we'll need a different community to take a turn. So that's a second ask, and we can provide training and support and facilitate zoning and all of that with the city. The third opportunity is to really look at doing this mid to long-term accompaniment. And I'm going to say a little bit about it, and then Allison, if you want to say something, Allison is with the Colorado Hosting Asylum Network, that would be great too. But the model that Chan has been using is to have a faith community say, we're willing to support, say, 3 individuals or families. So the faith community identifies, okay, we have a space where those folks can stay at the faith community or in somebody's house or in a pastorage or wherever, a safe place. And then we have a group of folks who's going to support that individual in registering their kids for school and, you know, accompanying them to their court hearing or their check-in, and helping them save up to be independent on their own and connecting them to mental health services and a whole raft of resources. And that they've found that model to be really successful, where people are usually independent on average within 5 months. And so what they would do is provide your community with that training, and then connect you to other communities who are also doing that hosting, so you can support one another. Yeah, I'm gonna stop and see if Allison, if you wanna say one more word about that, and then I see Tom's hand too.
Okay, sure. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone. I think I'll just talk for a brief moment a little more about the teams. Jennifer did a great job of describing how we put them together. And I think that our success rate is so high because of the fact that our teams consist of anywhere between 6 and 12 people. So back in the day, it used to be that any particular family would invite, for example, invite a family to live with them, invite an asylum-seeking family to live with them, and they would be the hosts, and they would handle all of the other things that Jennifer mentioned. And those models, as noble as they are, were not sustainable, because it's simply too much responsibility for any one person or family. And so we have come up with a model that connects people in the community or in a faith-based community. Some of our teams are made up of people that didn't know each other prior, but all live in the same place and wanted to do something to help. And so, between everybody on a team, as I said, between 6 and 12 people, the idea, if everyone is doing what they signed up to do, that no one person is feeling overwhelmed or overburdened. And I think that's something that is attractive to like-minded organizations in other cities in the country. So I'm going to put our website in the chat. It's Colorado Hosting Asylum Network, or CHAN for short. And I'll put the website in the chat right now. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you so much, Allison. I definitely encourage people to check out the website. There's a lot more details about what those responsibilities look like. And I'm also going to drop in the chat an interest form that includes all the things I just mentioned. And if you mark it, and you could share this widely with all of your networks, I'm going to send it out to our listserv tomorrow. But this, if you mark that you want to do the long-term accompaniment, you're going to get connected with CHAN for training and for follow-up. If you mark that you're doing the short-term stuff, then AFSC and this other faith community. And the reason I'm not mentioning them is we want to share this recording, and we don't want the site to be public yet. So I'm sorry if that seems super vague. We'll connect with you and start to talk with you about how you can get your community more involved on that front. So, Tom?
Yeah, 2 questions. One, so you mentioned 5 months to independent functioning. That assumes that people have work permits, I suppose, huh? No?
Not always. So CHAN, for somebody to be hosted as part of CHAN's official network, they do need to be in asylum proceedings. And then one of the things that the network helps people with is applying for those employment authorizations. So if you have a court process for asylum, you can apply for employment authorization. And actually, the Biden administration just removed some of the fees that people have to pay for that, which is great. But not everyone who's being released is in asylum proceedings. So some folks, the folks who have humanitarian parole, for example, are not going to be able to apply for that work permit, and they'll need to access, you know, other options for sustenance, whether that's day labor or contract work, or other work. An employment authorization definitely makes resettling in the U.S. easier. But I think just to be clear, I think the ask is to host folks, regardless of the status that they're in. And we know that it will be more difficult for folks who can't access that employment authorization. But there's no way for the groups at the border to sort of screen the easiest folks to us, right? And part of the call to welcome and resettle is to do the same work that they're doing there. So that's a really good question, though. I'm glad you mentioned it, because it's an additional orientation for folks, right, who are brand new to the U.S. and maybe don't know that you have to have permission to not only be here, but to work. And I know Lupe has seen a lot of confusion from recent arrivals with our work in Fort Morgan. Our work in Fort Morgan is almost exclusively focused on recently arrived folks from like 2 months ago to, I think the longest one of our members has been here is 3 years. So we're learning a lot about what it's like to be brand new to the U.S.
All right, so the other question is, so are you contemplating a model kind of like what the MDSC did, to have a host community supported by supporting faith communities, or what's that model look like in your mind right now?
I think it depends on which part you're talking about. So for the short-term 72-hour accompaniment, yes, we are hoping that some faith communities, maybe two, I think probably 2 or 3 would be enough, would step up to support that volunteer effort, because it would allow us to say yes to our partners at the border more frequently than if it's just the faith community doing it. I think for hosting of families and individuals, the hope is that if there were smaller faith communities, maybe a couple faith communities could connect and support 1 or 2 families. But for larger faith communities, I think the hope is that that whole faith community would take on doing that longer accompaniment at UPEC because the number of folks is going to be such that we need people to sort of own a family or 2 for that longer term accompaniment. Pat?
So are there were 3 churches that were involved last time buses arrived in Denver. Are those 3 churches involved in this effort at this time?
One of them is, and the other 2 I've been outreaching to. Yeah. And I think that actually is another great point. As you sort of think about this, we have an invitation email that we could share with you. I think it would be great if folks are part of a faith community to talk with your denomination about this. We had an initial conversation with some folks in Fort Collins, an interdenominational group in Fort Collins, who I think are going to try to talk to their denomination. And I think that's important because, again, we all know the metro area for housing, the challenges are steep, even for people who've been here for a long time, right? And so trying to search for that mid to longer term accompaniment in a space like Fort Morgan, we're really of some parts of the I-70 corridor where there is work and there are communities that speak Spanish. It's not the middle of nowhere, but there's a little slightly less insane housing prices and slightly more availability. Like in Denver, it's so hard to even find a space that's open in the metro area, let alone one you can afford. So some of our hope is to have that mid and longer term accompaniment be a little more outside of the metro area. But that's our dream. I don't know. We'll get there. I think that would be the most supportive to the people who are coming. I don't know, Lupe, if you're available in a place where you can talk, but I would love for you to also just talk a little bit about the trainings that we've been doing for other groups that we can also offer to people who are doing accompaniment about how to orient people to their rights in the United States. Not the whole training, but just if you want to say a couple words about what we've been learning. Is that you, Lupe? Okay, I think she's not available, but I'll just say that we've done a couple of trainings on what we've learned over the last 2 years of organizing asylum seekers in Fort Morgan. That's really straightforward on some of the paperwork and things to watch for on the front end. So I feel really excited about between what Chan has learned over the last 3 years and what we've learned over the last 2 years, that we can really help people not only resettle here, but have a good shot at continuing their legal case. But yeah, David?
So I was just wondering what lessons can be learned from the Afghan refugee effort in settling Afghan refugees. I can see one obvious difference in that there's not a receiving community and ethnic structure behind this, but how has that effort been organized that might help?
Yeah, so I'll just say one thing, and then actually before I say one thing, has anybody on the call been involved in resettling? So Patrick and Kleinkopf both have. I don't know if either of you want to share anything that you feel like you've learned from being a part of that resettlement effort, like what was key, what was helpful, and maybe any barriers you didn't anticipate.
I think what I would say is that my church is part of a three-church effort to walk alongside one particular family. It's obviously been very rewarding and is very much in the model that Chen uses. The big difference with the Afghan families is many of them, not all of them, but many of them came with more rights than any of the Venezuelans or Cubans or Nicaraguans are going to have. So it's, in many cases, less of an ask in terms of helping them to settle long-term. On the other hand, the language barriers were often much more significant.
So,
Pat?
yeah, I don't want a lot of this to go real public right now. I'm working with a specific family, and they have an SIV, a special immigrant visa, which is about as good as it gets, as far as I can tell. You know, they're here, they can work, they can do anything. I mean, they're not, you know, they're not citizens, but they're going to receive green cards. They already have social security numbers. They've been here 1 month. They have an apartment. The rent is being paid for by the US government. They bought a car. I mean, the parents are looking for work, the kids are in school. I mean, it's welcome to the USA, you know, God bless America type stuff. And I feel like anybody coming here deserves my help and support. But it's a very, very different experience for me after all the years of working with undocumented people who are looking over their shoulder every minute. Anyway, if anybody wants to talk to me personally at some point, I might tell you more.
And the same thing is going on the border with Ukrainians versus other immigrants at the border. I guess for the purposes of this conversation, we want to be sure that our efforts are directed to the greatest need, which would not be the Ukrainians.
Or the Afghans, I would say. Some
Right,
Afghans
right,
have
that's-
humanitarian
yeah, that's my
parole,
point.
and they have 2 years to apply for asylum. They're actually receiving volunteer legal support through big agencies like Catholic Charities and Lutheran to get volunteer lawyers to help them do that.
Right.
As I say, they have the Cadillac entrance to the United States. The way I
Right.
see it.
And the
I'll just-
Ukrainians showing up at the border in Mexico are beautifully equipped centers to receive them, and 72 hours later they're crossing, and we know how that contrasts with everyone else.
And I think that the important point
Kathy,
with that, go ahead.
Can I say one thing before you? And then you can jump in. To David's point, I think one of the things that really helps both with the Ukrainian and the Afghan resettlement efforts was having staff from some larger groups like the International Rescue Committee, Immigrant Lutheran Family Services, and the governor's staff, the Office of Emergency Management, coordinate that initial arrival and provide shelter and support as people transition then into churches, faith communities, mosques, and individual support like what Patrick's doing. That coordination and shelter support is a big part of the puzzle that I think all of us who are involved right now as organizations have been doing quiet advocacy around, but we may start to do a little louder advocacy around, because it's such an important part of the puzzle to have that sort of like streamlined entry path for folks. So go ahead, Kathy. I'm sorry I cut you off. I just wanted to not forget my point.
Well, I think along that same line, I think part of it, an important way of looking at that is to say, this is what we are capable of doing and what everybody deserves. And so why it only happens for some people and not others is, of course, a huge question. And we know what a lot of the answers are to it. But the other thing is, even out the border, and this, I don't have numbers, but just anecdotally, I've heard from lawyers at the border that when they go, because there are a few people at the border who have lawyers when they go to the tent courts, not very many, but a few. But the cases from certain countries just go through more easily, even if maybe the facts of somebody's story are pretty similar to somebody else. One person is from Honduras and another who's from another country. That, and so much of it goes back to what is the US relationship with a particular country. And, you know, and that has a whole lot to do with who gets asylum and who doesn't. So I think just keeping in mind, that's not going to make a big difference in the day-to-day work of supporting people as they come here, but keeping in mind what, you know, some of those bigger long-term questions are.
So I have a question for all of you. And that question is, what would be most helpful for you to receive from AFSC and CHEN and Casa de Paz, so that you feel equipped to talk with your community, to talk with other faith communities or other community organizations. I know that there are in Chicago and in DC, there's also networks of, you know, like maybe 10 friends decides we want to walk alongside someone and can sign up and communicate that with the CARO Hosting Asylum Network and AFSC. It doesn't necessarily have to be a religious-based community. But what are the key things that you feel like you would most need leading this conversation if you were going to talk to a larger group about these apps? Kathy.
Well, I wanted to say something that's not exactly in response to this, but goes along with it. I think the other thing to look at is that there are some people coming who have particular needs, and I'm thinking particularly the LGBT community, and to have a way of reaching out to people here who would want to help be that connection. It doesn't mean everybody who works with a particular person or family needs to be part of the LGBT community, but just to make sure that those connections are there. And the other thing in terms of, for example, people with disabilities or serious health conditions. And they sometimes, theoretically, a lot of those folks, LGBT and people with disabilities and some health conditions aren't supposed to be stopped up at the border, but you know, what's supposed to happen doesn't always happen. But that would be another piece to keep in mind too.
So, yeah, in answer to your question, you know, Piper, you know, how would we take this to the meeting would be our question for Ruth and Kip and David and I. I think what would be helpful is if we could have some kind of discussion about, you know, my notes are pretty clear here about what you said about the short-term, you know, support being something that happens in Metro, but the longer-term stuff, even the accompaniment of a family, might be more appropriately in Fort Collins or Fort Morgan or someplace, right? And so the question I think that we need to answer for ourselves before we talk to the meeting would be where is the need that we could best plug into to meet?
And I think another way that, like Allison had mentioned, you know, if it seems like you're discerning with your community and folks are really feeling more drawn towards supporting accompaniment and there's also another way the model has worked is maybe a couple of communities fundraise to pay the rent for 3 months, and then the communities where that person is renting are the ones who do some of the like registering kids for school and that kind of stuff. So I'm not, if people want like a lot of close contact, that's not really enough, like that doesn't satisfy that yearning. But it is another way that people can support in sort of that resettlement. Just, I mean, even the 4 folks that Casa de Paz, myself and Denise worked with last week from Venezuela, just having 4 days at Casa de Paz was such a relief for them to not have to be wondering where they were going to be the next night and the next night, and they felt a little more like they could explore this place they just arrived in. So even that kind of predictability to be able to get your feet under you and start looking around can really help significantly. So yeah, I think it'll look different in each community. And then I think, yeah, I'll stop there. I'm a little scattered today, so I'm trying not to talk too terribly much. Other questions, other things you all feel like would be helpful? And
I look at my own faith community, and one of the things that would be really helpful to me in beginning to talk to them about this would be more just written, bulleted information about the short-term, both hosting option and support option, so that I could go to a group within the church or a committee and say, these are the sorts of things that would be required of us if we were thinking about being a host. These are the sorts of things that would be required and asked if we are thinking about putting together a rapid response support team.
Yes, that's helpful. And we can do that. I feel like we're close, having it almost. Other folks? So, once we say yes to, or we have a plane or a bus, arrive surprisingly, either way, there'll also be, sign up for individual volunteers to get involved and, support people on that short term, 72 hours sort of, cycle. And so we'll share that around with all of you. If we are saying yes to someone from the border, we'll probably have about a week notice, from when we say we're ready to when they send us a bus. So when that happens, that'll be another opportunity to push, and encourage a little more of the people around you. The other thing that we're trying to, iron out right now is how to better support the people who are just arriving, who are homeless, who are in the city, right now. And our shelters who support houseless people are doing an amazing job. They're serving 1,700 people a day right now. And, you know, they're at the limits of sort of their capacity just to serve the folks that are usually experiencing houselessness. And I think are wanting to really understand that this population is different and wanting to really support them in getting to the right spaces. And so we're trying to figure out, like, do we have a space that we could bring people to that's short term, who arrived, you know, this week, and maybe they could stay for a week and then try to connect them to longer term stuff, or just say that we can't, you know. Or I think what we're trying to be careful of is only helping the folks who come on a bus or a plane or something like that, because we know that the government is misleading. Government officials are misleading people about what resources are available to them when they arrive here. And I know that the Denver Rescue Mission has seen a fair amount of folks, and then also the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. It seems like what we're hearing is maybe over the last month about 100 Venezuelans have come through Denver Rescue Mission. So that to me doesn't sound coincidental. So we're trying to kind of figure out also what that support will look like, and when we have more of a plan, we can share that with you all too, or if you all have thoughts or ideas after you go home and sort of mull this over, feel free to let us know. If your faith community or your organization is interested in getting involved more with some of the planning, we're having these weekly calls with the city of Denver and bi-weekly calls with the state of Colorado. And your interest also gives more like political weight to the things we're asking for, to be real. So that's something else to consider after you've sort of talked with your community, whether this is something that people want to support with. I think it would be really, really helpful to have more folks show some interest and some willingness to plan too. Yeah. I feel like, maybe we could just go around to close and say, one thing we're feeling, one thing we are gonna try to do differently or do more of, kind of leaving here. So I'll just say that I feel really encouraged to see all of you. And I'm gonna put together a bulleted list of the requirements and the expectations for these different levels of hosting this week. And I'll pass it to Are you there, Marie?
Yeah, I am. I'm sorry. I didn't hear that you
Oh,
called me.
it's okay.
Sorry. I think where I am right now is I'm going to investigate it, but also I want to, since my congregation is so small, I want to see where I can fit in and be a piece of this process because it's so important.
And one word about how you feel.
Hopeful.
Thank you. Want to pass it to someone else? I'll do that. Rebecca? Are you there, Rebecca?
Sí, sí, aquí estoy. Are you getting an echo? I'm sorry. So I'm feeling really hopeful and encouraged and also like this showing out solidarity, just, the people that are already working with some folks, but also of the potential, like getting prepared for what is coming ahead of us is very important for me. So very encouraged to see this. I also want to say hi here. There's a big commitment from all of us here and the community that wasn't able to be here tonight. So we should, I commit to find ways of communicating the message once it's developed and what the needs are. So that will be my to-do. And I will is that responding to the questions, right? And I will pass it to Kathy Booker.
Well, I'm also very encouraged to see so many people, and also, as Rebecca was saying, to think about the fact that there are a lot more people out there who care very deeply about this and would want to be involved. And one of the things I'm thinking about, especially when I've been involved with Annunciation House in El Paso, they are incredibly well organized and they have their goals and objectives. I mean, they've been operating for 35 or 40 years. They're not new at this, but their procedures, what they expect from everybody is all really carefully laid out. And I think that really lends to their success. So on the very practical logistical side, I'm thinking about as a group that's kind of new at coming together in this way, the more we can do that, the better. So I'm interested in helping with that. And also, getting the word out to other folks who might not get to this information by talking about faith communities. They might come at it from a different way. So that's what I'm thinking. I'm feeling thoughtful about all these things. I will pass to Pat.
Okay, well, I have this thought that with the upcoming elections, maybe this is the time to lean on some of these candidates and put it out there and say, look, if you really believe what you're saying about helping people and supporting the poor, we're going to have a big opportunity in Denver and we need your help.
Do you have a word how you're feeling?
Oh, do I choose someone? Let's hear from Tom.
I'm going to ask Kip, Ruth, or David to chime in because you've heard a lot from me. You know where I'm at.
Well, I'm feeling a couple of different things. I always feel saddened when we're having to be reminded of the inequities and the horrors and what people have to go through to survive. And that always saddens me. I'm also feeling appreciation for all of you providing this information. And I think that I would echo something that I think Kathy said in terms of the organization. That is absolutely crucial. The many hands make the work lighter. So to the extent, even if someone just takes a small piece, you add all those pieces together and it can be very powerful. And I am probably going to defer to Ruth and David and Tom on anything too specific. But I've shared with a number of people in the meeting that I think we have an apartment facility that has been used and is not currently being used. And it seems like it's a resource that I would like to see it be used on a regular basis, whether that's for, a real short term, you have a number of people that use it to just get settled for a few days, or maybe it's a longer commitment. But that's one of those things that I would like to see our meeting be more active on. And I would throw it to Ruth.
Yeah, well, I haven't been involved in this conversation for a while, and it seems good timing to bring back to the meeting current needs and what we can do. So I'm just interested in where this might go in terms of bringing some opportunities to Friends meeting. So, David?
Well, I guess if I'm asking how I feel about this, I feel a bit overwhelmed by the information, by the scale of what we're trying to contemplate. We saw a little bit of that one time when there was an overflow bus from the border, but that was just kind of a passing through. I've watched how some of the Afghan churches have gotten involved with the Afghan groups, and been amazed at the amount of time and commitment that people said that it took to help. And so the scale of organization and effort is bigger than what we attempted with the sanctuary effort. So, but I think it's doable. But I would like to learn from the people who have and the professionals in the refugee settlement processes of what they can teach us and train us to do. So I'm happy to be here with all of you exploring this. So let's see who hasn't spoken here.
I haven't, so I'll speak up. In terms of feeling, I think I'll play on the words that have already been used of saddened and overwhelmed. But in feeling that, humbled of how can I feel that when we have these large groups of people whose lives have been totally turned upside down. And I've had a little contact in the last few months with a Venezuelan family who are up in Longmont, although they may have moved even further into the mountains. I'm trying to find out about that. So I have a little, personal connection with people who are in this situation.
I think in terms of anything I might be able to do in the future, I'd really like to get the written materials and go through those and see where it probably wouldn't be the major focus of my own faith community, but there might be individuals within who'd like to get involved in ways that they can personally support, even if we didn't do it as a larger congregation, which is going through various transitions of its own right now. Anyway, so staying tuned and figuring out how to participate. And Connie Curtis hasn't spoken.
So I will. I echo all of those feelings, and especially Harriet, yours about how could I feel anything else knowing what the people at the border have experienced and all that. You heard from Patrick a little bit about our community, 1030 Catholic community, being involved with Afghan refugees, and we have some people that are involved with doing legal kinds of work. And so I think we too need to be receiving the information and kind of looking at what 1030 might be able to do. Right off the bat, one of my thoughts would be that we could ask our community, we have quarterly contributions, we could ask our community to make a contribution, to pay rent or that sort of thing. The other thing that occurs to me, and I'm not sure whether anybody in this network has already been pursuing it, but where are the connections with the Lutheran denomination, with the Presbyterian denomination, and who has connections and that might be able to provide added resources because they know the church out in Fort Morgan and maybe they could be making those kind of connections. So anyway, thanks for all of this information tonight. It was really helpful.
I think, let's see, Lupe o Beatriz, o Lupe se fue. Beli, ¿tienes algún pensamiento o sentimiento que gustaría compartir con el grupo?
Hola.
¿Estás ahí, Beli?
It's a riot.
Yeah, there's a lot of kids. Si no puedes hablar está bien, pero si puedes quitarse de modo, no da pena el ruido que tiene.
Una disculpa, estoy en la clase de karate de mi hija, pero estoy escuchando todo y no podía hablar allá adentro. Sobre el tema que estamos tratando, pues ya habíamos tenido una reunión con la mesa de newcomers y estábamos, no sé si ustedes, Jennifer, sepan de la vigilia que se va a hacer el día 2 de noviembre afuera del centro de inmigración. Sería una buena opción también para invitar a todas estas personas para que se sientan en comunidad. Todos decirles que son bienvenidos y que están invitados, ¿verdad? Pero realmente como hacerlos parte de que se sientan en casa. Eso es lo que yo pienso, ¿verdad? No sé si esté bien con eso o como en qué más pueda enfatizar el tema.
Me gusta. I love this idea of inviting folks that we need who are resettling to our state to the vigil, but also having a call to action for the larger community to get involved in this effort during the vigil. Thanks, Betty. Allison?
Hi, I'm still here. I just want to say thank you for everything. Thank you to everybody, especially Jennifer, for facilitating all of this. I feel hopeful. I feel motivated. Tomorrow's another day.
Thanks, Allison. Let's see. So I wanted to say also something to this group that I said to the folks in Fort Collins, because a lot of those folks are already pretty deeply involved in the Afghan resettlement work. And that is, while you've been doing that work, what other faith communities have said to you, that's so cool that you're doing that? Because this would be a great ask for those folks to pick up. I think, like, I want to be careful to not overstress the same communities over and over again. So maybe if your faith community is already walking with Afghan folks or Ukrainian folks, maybe this is an opportunity for your pastor to make a similar call to the one that I got on Labor Day from Annunciation House, right? Like, we've been doing this part, we've been learning so much. It has enriched our community, and it's taught us so much, and it's given us a huge opportunity. And now we are being asked to respond to a different community, and we need your community to walk along and respond to this as well. So I think several, or if you belong to a faith community that's part of a denomination, it's also an opportunity to say back to your denomination, we're doing this part of welcoming folks. Who else could be doing it? Because we can't shoulder all of this, right? So I think, like, I don't want to tell you don't ask your community if they're already doing Afghan resettlement, because maybe the community is big enough to do both or have a small part in this, but also to think, like, you're a model for other folks. You really are. And you have a lot of knowledge now to support and accompany other faith communities in starting this work. So if there's anybody who's ever reached out to you when you were doing sanctuary, when you were doing the buses, when you were doing Afghan stuff, to say, I wish my faith community would do that, now is the time to call those folks and say, we really need you. We can't say yes to this because we're already doing this other thing. So I just wanted to uplift that. And so what I will commit to doing is I'm gonna send you all the report from what we learned from 2019. We have a whole report, and in that report is also a lot of the specifics of what the short-term requirements look like. But I'll also make a shorter, clear, bulleted, like, here's the requirements for each level of hosting. And I'll be sure to say whether you're a faith community, a group of friends, an organization, so that it's open to lots of different communities to participate. And then I also will reach out to the folks at the International Rescue Committee to see if they have some of the best practices for the short term and the longer term stuff that this group is committed to doing, AFSC and Shan and Cusvikas. Because I hear you, David, on, like, let's not reinvent the wheel. And then the last thing I'll say is that the folks who are doing the short term, tonight they're training some of their leads from in their community, but they have a lot of I know a lot of you know me that I'm not, like, a super detail-oriented person, but the folks at this faith community who did this last time are, and they have, like, a whole workflow and trainings for each lead, for each area of volunteering that is really useful for anyone who wants to do that short-term shelter, potentially in January through March. So that part of it is super well organized. Because I wasn't the one who developed it. Somebody who is like very logistics and detail oriented developed that. And then I'll also ask Annunciation House, I think that we have from 2019, their roles and expectations, but I'll ask them if they've been updated. Because if they have, then we should definitely take advantage of that. And I will send you all a follow-up email within the next week with all this information. And in the meantime, you have Allison's email if you have specific questions for the Hosting Asylum Network. Y'all have my email, so, and then we'll be in touch soon. So thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And thank you to Gisela for interpreting. Thank you so much. Night.
Good night.